But no one knew exactly what would happen if hundreds of these engineers suddenly returned. For several years, the changes were subtle. Too subtle for casual observation. But marine researchers monitoring plankton, fish populations, and seabird activity began noticing patterns. In areas where gray whales fed regularly, the ecosystem started behaving differently. Sediment chemistry shifted. New species appeared in benthic surveys. Fish distributions changed, and seabirds began gathering in unusually large numbers. It looked like the whales were triggering a cascade of ecological reactions. But the most surprising changes weren't happening on the seafloor. They were happening throughout the entire food web. Because every time a whale churned up the sediment, clouds of nutrients rose into the water. And those nutrients were feeding something invisible, something microscopic, something powerful enough to alter the entire coastal ecosystem. Scientists were only beginning to notice the signal. A subtle but persistent increase in phytoplankton productivity near whale feeding zones. If this pattern continued, it could mean something remarkable. The whales weren't just feeding in the ecosystem. They were fertilizing it. But the data was still incomplete, and researchers needed years of observation before they could confirm what was really happening. Because if the numbers were correct, then the return of 400 gray whales might be doing something no one had fully predicted. They might be restarting a lost ecological process, one that had been missing from the Pacific coast for nearly a century. And the consequences of that process were only beginning to unfold. For several years, the change was almost invisible. The Pacific coastline still looked the same from above. Cold currents still rolled southward along the continental shelf. Kelp forests still swayed in the surf zone. But beneath the surface, the seafloor was becoming increasingly disturbed. Every summer and autumn, gray whales began returning to the same shallow feeding areas along the Pacific coast, particularly along Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Here, the continental shelf slopes gently outward from the coastline. Water depths range from 20 to 60 meters. Perfect conditions for gray whales to feed. Researchers tracking the animals with drones and acoustic tags began noticing a pattern. The whales were not feeding randomly. They were targeting dense patches of benthic invertebrates buried within the sediment. Amphipods, ghost shrimp, small tube-dwelling worms. To reach them, the whales performed a very specific behavior. They rolled onto their side, then plunged their heads into the seafloor. Using massive tongues and powerful throat muscles, they sucked sediment and prey into their mouths before filtering the mud through their baleen plates. Each feeding event created a crater nearly 2 meters wide, and sometimes half a meter deep. When one whale feeds, the disturbance is temporary. But when hundreds of whales repeat this process day after day, the seabed transforms into a constantly churned mosaic of pits and mounds. Marine ecologists call this type of disturbance bioturbation, the physical mixing of sediments by living organisms. In many ecosystems, bioturbation is performed by small animals, worms, clams, or burrowing crustaceans. But gray whales operate on a completely different scale. They are among the largest bioturbators on the planet, and their return to Pacific coastal feeding zones effectively restarted a process that had been absent for decades. At first glance, disturbing the seafloor might sound destructive, but in ecology, disturbance often creates opportunity. When whales excavate the sediment, they expose layers that have been buried for years. Organic material trapped beneath the surface suddenly becomes available. Nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, are released into the surrounding water. And within hours, microscopic life begins to respond. Phytoplankton. These tiny drifting algae are the foundation of almost every marine food web. They require sunlight, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. The Pacific coastal waters already provide the sunlight and carbon, but nutrients are often the limiting factor. When gray whales churn the seabed, nutrient-rich sediment rises into the water column like underwater dust storms. Oceanographers studying the feeding zones noticed that nutrient concentrations spiked shortly after whale feeding events. In particular, dissolved nitrogen levels increased. Within days, satellite imagery began detecting small but measurable increases in chlorophyll concentrations, a signal of growing phytoplankton populations. It was the first hint that the whales were triggering a bottom-up ecological effect. In simple terms, they were fertilizing the ocean. This phenomenon is sometimes called the whale pump. Large whales feed at depth and release nutrients into surface waters through waste, sediment disturbance, and movement. Historically, whale populations were enormous. Before industrial whaling, the world's oceans may have contained millions of large whales. Their combined nutrient cycling likely played a significant role in maintaining marine productivity. But when whaling drastically reduced whale numbers, that nutrient system weakened. For decades, scientists believed the loss of whales had only removed predators from marine ecosystems. Now, evidence suggested something deeper. The oceans may also have lost a major nutrient recycling system. And along the Pacific coast, the return of gray whales appeared to be slowly restoring it. The effects became clearer as researchers expanded their monitoring. In regions where gray whales fed frequently, phytoplankton blooms became slightly more intense and slightly longer lasting. This change might sound small, but even a modest increase in phytoplankton productivity can ripple through the food web, because phytoplankton feed zooplankton, tiny drifting animals like copepods and krill, and zooplankton feed small fish, anchovies, herring, juvenile rockfish. These small fish, in turn, support seabirds, marine mammals, and larger predatory fish. Within several seasons, marine biologists studying coastal fish populations began detecting subtle shifts. Juvenile fish densities increased in certain whale feeding areas, particularly during late summer, when phytoplankton growth was strongest. The connection was still difficult to prove directly. Ocean ecosystems are influenced by many variables: currents, temperature, storms, and seasonal cycles. But the pattern kept appearing. Where whales fed regularly, productivity increased. Yet the whales were also changing the ecosystem in another way, a way scientists hadn't fully anticipated. Because every feeding crater left behind by a whale becomes a new microhabitat. After the whale moves on, the pit fills slowly with sediment. But before it disappears, other species arrive. Small fish search the disturbed sediment for exposed prey. Crabs and shrimp move into the crater edges. Suspension-feeding organisms, like sea cucumbers and certain clams, colonize the fresh surfaces. In effect, each whale feeding pit becomes a temporary hotspot of biodiversity. Field studies along the Oregon coast found that whale feeding zones supported significantly higher species diversity compared to undisturbed seabed nearby. It was similar to what ecologists observe in forests after fallen trees open gaps in the canopy. Disturbance creates new ecological niches. But perhaps the most dramatic response came from above the water: seabirds. For decades, seabird colonies along the Pacific coast have relied heavily on seasonal fish migrations. But as whale feeding intensified, researchers began noticing large flocks of seabirds gathering near whale activity. Species like shearwaters, gulls, and murres began following feeding whales. When whales stirred up the seabed, small fish and crustaceans were forced upward. For seabirds, it was an easy meal. Drone footage captured scenes where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of birds hovered over feeding whales, diving repeatedly into the nutrient-rich water. In essence, the whales were acting like underwater plows, bringing buried food within reach of surface predators. And the chain reaction didn't stop there. Increased seabird activity meant more guano, nutrient-rich bird waste, falling back into the ocean. This added even more nitrogen and phosphorus to coastal waters, which fueled more phytoplankton growth, which fed more zooplankton, which supported more fish. It was a classic positive feedback loop, a biological cascade triggered by the physical behavior of whales. Yet despite these observations, scientists remained cautious. Ecosystems are complex. Temporary patterns can easily be mistaken for long-term trends. Researchers needed long-term data. Years of monitoring plankton levels, fish surveys, seabird counts, and whale movements. And as the years passed, that dataset began to grow. Oceanographic stations along the Pacific coast collected continuous measurements. Satellite monitoring improved. Autonomous underwater vehicles mapped seafloor disturbances. Gradually, a clearer picture began to emerge. The return of gray whales wasn't just creating short-term ecological disturbances. It was reshaping the energy flow of the coastal ecosystem. But the most surprising discovery was still ahead. Because 20 years after the whales began returning, scientists started noticing changes that extended far beyond the feeding zones. Changes that were beginning to influence entire coastal fisheries, and even the stability of nearby kelp forests. The whales had restarted an ecological engine. Now researchers were about to discover just how powerful that engine could become. By the time 2 decades had passed, the return of gray whales to the Pacific coast was no longer a curiosity. It had become one of the most fascinating natural experiments unfolding in the modern ocean. Marine scientists now had nearly 20 years of continuous data, tracking whale movements, plankton productivity, seabird populations, seafloor disturbance, and coastal fish communities. And slowly, the long-term pattern began to emerge. The whales were not just altering local feeding areas. They were reshaping the entire coastal ecosystem. One of the clearest signals came from satellite observations. Oceanographers regularly monitor ocean productivity by measuring chlorophyll concentrations in surface waters. Chlorophyll is produced by phytoplankton, the microscopic algae that form the base of marine food webs. When scientists compared 2 decades of satellite data along the Pacific Northwest coast, something unusual appeared. Regions with consistent gray whale feeding activity showed persistent increases in seasonal phytoplankton productivity. The increase was not dramatic, often between 5 and 12% depending on the year. But in ecological systems, even a small rise in primary productivity can have powerful consequences. Because phytoplankton sit at the very bottom of the energy pyramid. More phytoplankton means more food for zooplankton. More zooplankton means more small fish. And more small fish ripple upward through the entire food web. Fisheries scientists began noticing this effect first. Surveys conducted by research vessels along the continental shelf started recording higher densities of juvenile forage fish. Species like Pacific herring, northern anchovy, and juvenile rockfish showed noticeable increases in certain nearshore zones. These species are critically important. They form the dietary backbone for larger predators, salmon, seabirds, seals, sea lions, and even larger fish. At first, the increase was attributed to natural ocean cycles. The Pacific Ocean is influenced by large-scale climate patterns like El Niño and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. These cycles can dramatically change ocean productivity from year to year. But the spatial pattern told a different story. Fish increases were strongest near areas where gray whales repeatedly fed. It suggested that whale-driven nutrient cycling was amplifying local productivity. In other words, the whales were not replacing natural ocean processes. They were strengthening them. Meanwhile, researchers studying the seafloor discovered another unexpected shift. Over time, whale feeding pits had begun altering the physical structure of coastal sediments. When the whales first returned, their feeding left behind temporary craters. But after years of repeated disturbance, entire patches of seabed became permanently more mixed. This mixing prevented sediments from compacting too tightly. It allowed oxygen to penetrate deeper into the seabed, and that oxygen supported larger populations of burrowing organisms. Clams, polychaete worms, burrowing shrimp. These animals further mixed the sediment, reinforcing the process started by the whales. Marine ecologists sometimes refer to this as ecosystem engineering feedback. One species initiates a physical change. Other species maintain and expand it. The result is a new, stable ecological structure. But the most dramatic transformation appeared in a place no one initially expected: the kelp forests. Along the Pacific coast, kelp forests form one of the most important marine habitats. These towering underwater algae provide shelter for fish, crabs, sea urchins, and countless other species. Yet in recent decades, many kelp forests have struggled. Climate warming, marine heat waves, and exploding sea urchin populations have caused widespread kelp loss in parts of the Pacific. Scientists studying whale feeding zones noticed something surprising. In some areas near frequent whale activity, kelp forests were more resilient. They recovered faster after storms. And sea urchin populations appeared lower. The connection took time to understand. But eventually researchers traced it back through the food web. Here's how the chain reaction worked. Whale feeding increased nutrient availability. More nutrients boosted phytoplankton productivity. More phytoplankton supported larger zooplankton populations. Those zooplankton fed small fish. Some of those fish species, like juvenile rockfish and certain wrasses, are important predators of sea urchins. Sea urchins are the primary grazers that can destroy